Struggling musician helps a black owner save his dying music store. What follows changes their lives. Before we dive into this incredible story of hope and kindness, we'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming content. The cold was a thief. It crept through the single-pane window of Lena's small apartment, stealing the warmth from her tea, from the tips of her fingers, from the very air in her lungs. Outside, a relentless November rain washed the city in shades of gray, blurring the streetlights into hazy, indifferent stars. Lena sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress, a worn acoustic guitar resting across her lap. Its wood was scarred, its finish faded, but it was her only constant, the sole inheritor of her secrets and her sorrows. An eviction notice, crisp and cruel, lay on the rickety nightstand beside a single, wilting daisy in a glass jar. It gave her 3 days. 3 days to find a miracle in a city that had long since stopped believing in them. Her fingers, stiff from the chill, found the frets. She didn't play a song, just a series of melancholic chords that seemed to ask a question for which there was no answer. The sound was thin, swallowed by the room's oppressive silence. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow ache that echoed the emptiness in her bank account. She was a musician without a stage, a storyteller without an audience. For 2 years since aging out of the foster care system, she had poured every ounce of her being into her music, working dead-end jobs to pay the rent, only to find herself right back here, on the precipice of losing everything. The city was a symphony of noise, but her own quiet music was being drowned out. She pulled on a threadbare coat and stepped out into the rain, needing to walk, to feel the sting of the wind on her face, anything to feel alive. Her feet carried her down familiar streets where old brick facades were being steadily replaced by the sterile glass and steel of luxury condos. The neighborhood was shedding its skin, and people like her were being sloughed off with it. There was one place, however, that refused to change. One stubborn, beautiful holdout against the tide of gentrification. Blackwood's Blues. The music shop was a relic, a time capsule from an era when music was made of wood and wire and soul. Its neon sign, a graceful blue saxophone, flickered erratically, half of its light surrendered to the years. The windows were dusty, displaying faded posters of blues legends and a few lonely-looking instruments. It was owned by Mr. Alistair Blackwood, a man as old and weathered as the storefront itself. He was a quiet man with kind eyes and hands that looked like they had wrestled stories from the very heart of the earth. Lena had never bought anything from him. She couldn't afford to, but she would often stand outside, just to feel the history that radiated from the place. As she approached, her heart sank. A man in a sharp, expensive suit stood in front of the shop, his polished shoes somehow repelling the grime of the wet pavement. He was taping a notice to the heavy wooden door. It wasn't an eviction notice. It was worse. It was a foreclosure notice, stark white against the dark wood. A tombstone for a place that was still breathing. The man, Mr. Sterling, the developer who was buying up the block, gave the notice a final, smug tap and turned away. He glanced at Lena, his eyes sweeping over her worn coat with casual disdain before he climbed into a sleek black car that purred at the curb. He was a vulture in a tailored suit, and he had just claimed his prize. Through the window, Lena could see the silhouette of Mr. Alistair, standing motionless in the dimly lit interior, his shoulders slumped in defeat. That was it. That was the moment a choice presented itself, a quiet crossroads in the downpour. She could keep walking, back to her own cold room and her own insurmountable problems, or she could open the door. With a breath that felt like it was drawn from the very bottom of her reserves, Lena reached out and pushed open the door to Blackwood's Blues. A small bell chimed, a fragile, hopeful sound in the face of despair. The air inside smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and something deeper, something like history itself. The walls were lined with guitars that hung like sleeping sentinels. A dusty piano sat in one corner, its keys yellowed like old teeth. It was a sanctuary, and it was about to be desecrated. Mr. Alistair stood behind the counter, his back to her, staring at the foreclosure notice visible through the glass. He didn't turn around. "Heard the bell," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "If you're here to pick over the bones, you're a little early. They don't auction it all off till Friday." "I'm not here for that, Mr. Blackwood," Lena said softly. He finally turned, his eyes tired but sharp. He recognized her from her quiet vigils on the sidewalk. The girl with the guitar case and the sad eyes. "What can I do for you?" Lena's gaze fell upon her own reflection in the glass of a display case. She saw a young woman on the verge of disappearing. She clutched the strap of her worn guitar case, the only thing of value she owned. In her pocket were $43 and some change, the last of her money, meant to buy a few days' worth of groceries. An idea, reckless and illogical, sparked in her mind. It was a foolish, desperate gesture, a single candle against a hurricane, but it was something. "I'd like to buy a set of strings," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it had. She walked to the counter and pointed to a premium set, the kind she could never afford for herself. "The best ones you have." Mr. Alastair raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Those are $35, young lady." "You sure?" "Yes, sir," she said, pulling the crumpled bills from her pocket and smoothing them on the counter. She pushed them toward him. "And I was thinking, maybe you could use some help, cleaning up, polishing the instruments. Just making the place look loved again." She hesitated, then plunged forward. "I could sit in the window and play. Maybe it would draw some people in. Maybe if they saw there was still life in here, still music." Her voice trailed off. It sounded naive even to her own ears. A girl with a guitar trying to stop a developer with millions. It was absurd. Mr. Alastair looked from the money on the counter to her earnest, desperate face. He saw the frayed cuffs of her coat, the hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with food. He saw a reflection of his own stubborn, foolish love for a world that no longer seemed to want him. For a long moment he was silent. Then, a slow, sad smile touched his lips. "You're offering to play for a ghost," he said, but there was no malice in his tone. "Every ghost deserves a song," Lena replied. He looked at the money, then slowly pushed it back across the counter toward her. "Keep it. You need it more than I do." He then reached under the counter and pulled out the very set of strings she had pointed to. "But these are a down payment." He slid them over to her. "On your time. You want to fill this old place with music? Be my guest. Let's give the ghosts one last show." For the next 2 days, Lena and Mr. Alastair waged a quiet war against entropy. Lena arrived early each morning, her guitar on her back, and set to work. She dusted ancient amplifiers, polished the gleaming curves of saxophones until they shone like gold, and carefully wiped down every single guitar, her touch gentle and reverent. She felt like an archivist, preserving the sacred texts of a forgotten religion. Mr. Alastair worked alongside her, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. He'd pause, pick up a vintage Les Paul, and his gnarled fingers would dance across the fretboard, coaxing out a riff so full of sorrow and beauty that it made Lena's chest ache. He didn't play for long, just short, brilliant bursts of memory. They didn't talk much, but a profound understanding grew between them in the shared silence. They were two castaways on the same small island, surrounded by an indifferent sea. In the afternoons, Lena would take a stool and sit in the large front window, just as she'd promised. She propped the shop door open, letting the music spill out onto the gray sidewalk. She played everything she knew. She played soulful ballads that spoke of heartbreak and hope, nimble finger-picked melodies that sounded like falling rain, and raw, driving blues rhythms that were a cry of defiance. She played for the hurried pedestrians who barely glanced her way. She played for the pigeons pecking at crumbs on the pavement. She played for the ghosts in the dusty corners of the shop. A few people did stop. An elderly woman paused, listening with a wistful smile. A young man with headphones gave her a thumbs up. It wasn't a crowd, but it was a start. It was a flicker of light in the overwhelming dark. On the second evening, as the light began to fade, they sat together behind the counter. sharing a simple meal of sandwiches and hot tea that Lena had bought with the last of her own money. Mr. Alastair looked at the faded photograph of 4 young black men that was taped to his old cash register. They were sharp-suited, confident, holding their instruments like weapons. "That was us," he said, his voice soft. "The Crossroads Kings. We thought we were going to rule the world." "What happened?" Lena asked gently. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Life happened. The world changes. It forgets. Sometimes it's better to be forgotten." He looked at Lena, his gaze intense. "You've got a fire in your fingers, girl. A real fire. Don't ever let anyone put it out." His words were a gift, more valuable than any amount of money. For a moment, sitting in the warm, quiet store, surrounded by the sleeping instruments, Lena felt a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. It was a fragile piece, however, and it was shattered the next morning. The bell above the door chimed, not with the gentle sound of a curious customer, but with the aggressive clang of an intruder. Mr. Sterling stood in the doorway, a condescending smirk on his face. He let his eyes roam over the newly cleaned shop, the gleaming instruments, and Lena playing softly in the window. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with false admiration. "Look at this, polishing the brass on the Titanic. It's a valiant effort. I'll give you that." He walked directly toward Mr. Alastair, ignoring Lena completely. "Blackwood, I'm here to give you one final courtesy. My offer to buy you out expires at noon tomorrow. $10,000 for everything. It's more than this junk is worth, but I'm feeling generous. Take the deal, or the bank takes it all, and you walk away with nothing but dust in your pockets. This junk has more soul than you'll ever know," Mr. Alastair said, his voice steady, though Lena could see the tremor in his hands. "This store is not for sale." Sterling laughed, a short, ugly sound. "It's not your choice anymore. The bank owns it. I own the bank. The future owns this block, and it doesn't have room for this." He gestured around the store with a wave of his hand. Then his eyes landed on Lena. "And you?" he said, his tone shifting to one of predatory pity. "Don't you have better things to do than play nursemaid to a dying dream? A pretty girl like you, wasting your talent in a mausoleum." "I'm exactly where I need to be," Lena said, her fingers tightening on the neck of her guitar. Sterling's smirk widened. "Loyalty is a fine quality, but it doesn't pay the rent." He pulled a business card from his pocket and tossed it onto the counter. "When this place is a pile of rubble, my offer might still stand. I could always use some pleasant background music at my cocktail parties." He turned and walked out, the bell clanging his departure like a death knell. The air in the room felt heavy, poisoned by his presence. Noon tomorrow. The deadline was no longer an abstract threat. It was a ticking clock. As if on cue, Lena's phone buzzed with a text from her own landlord. "Rent is late. Locks will be changed tomorrow if payment is not received." The walls were closing in from all sides. The desperation that had been a quiet ache was now a screaming panic in her chest. She looked at Mr. Alastair, whose face was a mask of weary resignation. All their work, all the polishing and the music, felt like a child's sandcastle against the coming tide. The hurricane was here. That night, after Mr. Alastair had locked up and gone to his small apartment above the shop, Lena stayed. She couldn't face her own empty room and the eviction notice that waited there. She sat in the dark store, the only light coming from the flickering blue neon sign outside and the cold glow of the streetlights. She felt a profound sense of despair settle over her. She had tried. She had given her last dollars, her last energy, her last hope to this place, and it was all for nothing. Sterling was right. Loyalty didn't pay the rent. As she sat there, her fingers found a small, loose piece of wallpaper behind a shelf she had been cleaning earlier. Curious, she peeled it back. Tucked into a hollow space in the wall was a small, leather-bound book. It was a journal. Hesitantly, she opened it. The pages were filled with Mr. Alastair's elegant script. It was a log of the shop, but it was also a diary of his life. She read about his early days, about forming the Crossroads Kings with his three best friends, a fiery singer named Marcus, a stoic bassist named David, and a genius drummer named Leo. She read about their meteoric rise, their whirlwind tours, the adoration of fans. But then the tone shifted. She read about the pressures of fame, the temptations of the road, and a growing rift in the band. The final entry was dated 40 years ago. It described a terrible car accident on a rain-slicked highway after a show. Their brilliant drummer, Leo, had been killed. The band, shattered by grief and guilt, had simply stopped. They had made a pact to walk away from the music, from the fame, from the pain, and never look back. Mr. Alastair had come home and opened this shop, a quiet penance, a way to stay close to the music without having to make it himself. He had never spoken to the others again. Tears streamed down Lena's face as she read. This wasn't just a store. It was a memorial. It was a 40-year vigil for a lost friend and a lost dream. She looked at the faded photograph on the counter. The four smiling young men seemed to look back at her, their eyes full of a future that was never realized. Now she understood the depth of Mr. Alastair's sadness, the stubbornness of his refusal to let go. He wasn't just losing a business. He was losing the last piece of his friend, the last echo of his band. Suddenly, her own problems felt small. Her impending eviction, her poverty, it was all temporary. The grief Mr. Alastair carried was a life sentence. A new resolve hardened within her. This was no longer about saving a shop. It was about honoring a history. It was about fighting for a man who had forgotten how to fight for himself. She didn't know how, but she knew she couldn't give up. The next morning, the final morning, brought a cold, hard clarity. The air was thick with inevitability. Lena was there when Mr. Alastair came down, his face pale and drawn. She didn't tell him she'd found the journal. There was no need. She just looked him in the eye and said, "We're not done yet." Just then the bell chimed. It wasn't Sterling. It was a courier with a letter addressed to Lena. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was from Sterling's legal office. It was a formal offer, a sickening, insidious moral test. It stated that if she would sign an affidavit declaring Blackwood's Blues a public nuisance and a blighted property, citing its lack of business and dilapidated condition, Mr. Sterling's development company would not only pay her a sum of $5,000, but would also cover her rent for an entire year at a new, modern apartment in one of his other buildings. It was a lifeline. It was a way out of everything. It was food and warmth and security. It was a roof over her head. It was everything she had been praying for. All she had to do was betray the kind old man standing beside her. All she had to do was drive the final nail into the coffin of his life's work. She could see the path fork before her. One way led to safety, to comfort, to survival. The other led to this. Standing here in a failing shop, next to a defeated old man with absolutely nothing. Sterling had misjudged her. He thought her loyalty could be bought. He thought her integrity had a price tag. He thought that because she was poor, she was also cheap. Without a word, Lena walked to the counter. She took a pen, but not to sign the affidavit. She wrote a single word across the face of the offer in big, bold letters. "N.O.?" She then walked to the door and handed the letter back to the stunned courier. "Give this back to your boss." She turned back to Mr. Alastair. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. He had seen the letterhead. He understood the choice she had just made. "You shouldn't have done that, child," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He could have helped you." "Some things are more important than help, Mr. Alastair," Lena said, her voice shaking but firm. "Some things are just right." She picked up her guitar. There were only a few hours left until noon. She walked to the window, sat on her stool, and began to play. But this time she wasn't playing for the ghosts or the passers-by. She was playing for Mr. Alastair. She poured all of her pain, her defiance, her hope, and her sorrow into the music. She played the blues as if she had lived 1,000 years, her fingers flying across the frets, her voice soaring with a power that filled every corner of the dusty shop. It was a prayer, a protest, a final, beautiful act of rebellion. It was the only weapon she had left. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly toward noon. The final hour arrived, heavy and silent. The music had stopped. Lena and Mr. Alastair stood behind the counter, waiting for the end. The quiet was broken by the sound of a car door slamming outside. Then another, and another. It wasn't the sound of Sterling's sleek sedan. It was the sound of several cars, a fleet of them, pulling up to the curb. Mr. Alastair looked out the window, his eyes widening in disbelief. Lena followed his gaze. Lined up in front of the shop were 3 immaculate black town cars. From the cars emerged 3 elderly black men, all dressed in exquisitely tailored suits. They moved with an air of quiet power and authority. One was tall and regal, another was built like a mountain, and the third had a sharp, intelligent face that looked out from behind stylish glasses. They paused on the sidewalk, looking at the flickering neon sign of Blackwood's Blues as if seeing a ghost. Then, together, they walked toward the door. The bell chimed as they entered, and the 3 men stood there, their eyes locking on Mr. Alastair. A lifetime of unspoken words passed between them in an instant. "Al," the tall one said, his voice a rich baritone. "You old fool. You could have just called." Mr. Alastair was speechless, his hand gripping the counter for support. Tears welled in his eyes. "Marcus? David? Is that?" The man with the glasses smiled. "Took you long enough to need us, Slowhand." They were the Crossroads Kings, reunited after 40 years of silence. Just as they stepped forward to embrace their long-lost friend, Mr. Sterling arrived, flanked by 2 uniformed sheriffs. He strode in, his face a mask of triumph. "Noon, Blackwood. Time's up. As the new lien holder, I'm ordering you to vacate the premises." Before Mr. Alastair could even respond, the tall man, Marcus, stepped forward. "I don't believe you've been properly introduced," he said, his voice smooth as velvet but cold as steel. "I am Marcus Thorne, CEO of Thorne Global Media. This is David Chun, senior partner at Chan, Rourke, and Associates, the largest entertainment law firm in the country. And the gentleman you are so rudely trying to evict is our partner and oldest friend." Sterling's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion and alarm. "This is a legal foreclosure. This property," David Chin interrupted, stepping forward and opening a briefcase, "is the foundational asset of the newly formed Crossroads Legacy Foundation, a non-profit musical heritage organization which, as of 8 a.m. this morning, purchased not only this building, but the entire city block, including the 5 adjacent lots where you intended to build your soulless glass boxes." He slid a thick portfolio of documents onto the counter. "Your development permits have been challenged, your financing has been frozen, and my junior associates are currently filing a class action lawsuit against you for predatory acquisition practices. You, Mr. Sterling, are finished here." Sterling's face went white. He stared at the documents, then at the 3 powerful men, and finally at Mr. Alastair, as if seeing him for the first time. He stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence, before turning and practically fleeing the store, the sheriffs trailing behind him in confusion. The store was silent for a moment, and then it was filled with the sound of cathartic laughter and tearful reunion as the 4 old friends finally embraced. Lena stood off to the side, her heart pounding, watching this miracle unfold. After a few minutes, Mr. Alastair, his face transformed by a joy she had never seen, turned and beckoned her forward. "This is the one I told you about," he said to his friends. "This is Lena. She's the one who reminded me that this old place still had a song left in it." Marcus Thorne turned his warm, powerful gaze on Lena. "We heard, young lady. Alastair called us late last night. He told us everything. About your kindness. About your music. About the offer you refused." He walked over to a pristine, vintage 1959 Gibson ES-335 hanging on the wall, the sister instrument to the one Mr. Alastair famously played. He took it down gently. "Alastair also told us you have a fire in your fingers. We believe a fire like that deserves a proper home." He held the magnificent guitar out to her. "This is yours." Lena stared at the guitar, an instrument worth more than she had ever dreamed of earning in a lifetime. She was too stunned to speak. "That's not all," David Chin added, his expression kind. "The Crossroads Legacy Foundation's first official act is to establish a full scholarship to the Berklee College of Music. It's for a young guitarist of extraordinary talent and even more extraordinary character. The scholarship is named after our friend, Leo. And you, Lena, are its first recipient." The weight of it all, the guitar, the scholarship, the sudden, overwhelming reversal of fortune was too much. Lena finally broke down, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face. Mr. Alastair wrapped a fatherly arm around her shoulders. "I told you," he whispered. "Every ghost deserves a song. You just sang one powerful enough to bring the dead back to life in that moment, surrounded by these legendary men, holding a guitar that felt like destiny in her hands." Lena knew she was finally home. She had found her stage, her audience, and her family. The news of what happened at Blackwood's Blues spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The story of the forgotten blues legends returning to save their friend and the young, selfless musician who sparked the reunion became local folklore overnight. The community, which had been passive in the face of Sterling's hostile takeover, was galvanized. A massive block party was organized to celebrate. The street in front of the shop was closed off, a stage was erected, and the entire neighborhood turned out. That evening, under a string of twinkling lights, the Crossroads Kings played together for the first time in 40 years. When they took the stage, the crowd roared. They were older, their hair was gray, but the magic was still there. Mr. Alastair, holding his beloved guitar, looked 10 years younger. They played their old hits, the music pouring from them not as a performance, but as a testimony. It was the sound of reunion, of redemption, of joy resurrected. Halfway through their set, Marcus Thorne stepped to the microphone. "We wouldn't be here tonight if it weren't for someone with a heart bigger than this whole city," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "Someone who taught us that you're never too old to come home, and that kindness is the purest music there is. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the future of the blues, Miss Lena." He beckoned her onto the stage. The crowd erupted in applause. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked into the spotlight, the beautiful Gibson guitar feeling like a part of her. She looked out at the sea of faces, her neighbors, the people who had rushed past her just days ago, now looking at her with admiration and respect. She saw her old landlord in the crowd, his face a mixture of awe and regret. Then her eyes found Mr. Alastair, who gave her a proud, fatherly nod. She took a deep breath, stepped up to the mic, and with the Crossroads Kings backing her, she began to play. The music that flowed from her was no longer sad or desperate. It was triumphant. It was the sound of a soul set free. 1 year later, the block was unrecognizable. The threat of sterile condos was gone, replaced by a vibrant, thriving arts district. The Crossroads Legacy Foundation had transformed the building Sterling had coveted into a community haven. There were subsidized apartments for artists, rehearsal studios, a free health clinic, and a performance hall. And at the heart of it all, shining brighter than ever, was Blackwood's Blues. The shop had been lovingly restored and expanded, now serving as both a store and a museum, with a small classroom in the back. Lena stood in that classroom, home for the summer after her first incredible year at the conservatory. The vintage Gibson was slung over her shoulder as she patiently showed a young girl with wide, eager eyes how to form a G chord. The room was filled with the clumsy, hopeful sounds of a dozen children learning to play on instruments provided for free by the foundation. Mr. Alastair sat in his usual chair behind the counter, watching the scene with a contented smile, the other kings sitting with him, drinking coffee and arguing about chord progressions like no time had passed at all. After the lesson, Lena walked out onto the street. The sun was warm on her face. Music drifted from open windows. Laughter echoed from the cafe next door. She had a beautiful new apartment upstairs. Her debts were gone, and her future was brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. But the greatest gift was this feeling of belonging. She wasn't an orphan anymore. She had Alistair, Marcus, David, her uncles, her mentors, her family. She had a community that she had helped save, and that had saved her in return. She had learned that the most profound changes in life don't come from money or fame, but from a single, selfless act of kindness. It is a lesson that reminds us that when you give what little you have to help another, you often receive the entire world in return. What did you think of Lena's incredible journey? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to share this story with someone who needs a little bit of hope today.